Something that has been heard for decades surrounding the gaming sphere is that video games can cause violence and aggressive behavior, at least in regards to certain types of video games. One lecture of a game design class has lived rent-free in my head for years, where the professor pulled up a slide that posed the question of which video game is more violent, Battlefield or Kirby. At face value, Battlefield would be the most standard answer, as soldiers gun down opposing soldiers. But if you knew nothing about either game, how would you feel if I told you, in Kirby, you play as this creature who consumes his foes, steals their powers for himself, ruthlessly either beating up or killing anyone who stands in the way of his goals, which might be for something as simple as a slice of cake? Sounds like a ruthless villain prone to extreme violence without justifiable cause, an aspect affecting social acceptability we'll return to shortly. But despite the high degree of violence, these types of violence do not face anywhere near the same amount of scrutiny, as they feature a different kind of violence. We use terms such as cartoon violence to acknowledge this is seen as a kind of violence, but it's not violence in the traditional sense. Enemies disappear in puffs of smoke, get knocked off the screen, or just vanish when Kirby consumes them. This is not something that we typically see in the real world. What differentiates violence from cartoon violence is how much of a parallel it draws to real-world possibility. Take, for example, Exidy's 1976 arcade cabinet game, Death Race. Death Race was a film released in 1975 about racing across the country while running over pedestrians to gain points along the way.
It's a cross-country road wreck, and the traffic is murder.
And because in the 70s, blatantly copying other media was apparently a thing you could do without being sued for everything you own, the 1976 game, Death Race, came to be. This wasn't humans driving over pedestrians, though. It was these skeletal dudes running over gremlins. But because the game's title deliberately associated it with the movie, the story of the film became the narrative world of the game. No matter how many times Exidy executives claimed the figures were gremlins, or how many advertisements stressed that the object of the game was to chase monsters, severing the association with the film's pedestrian targets was an impossible feat. Exidy executives repeatedly claimed these were not humans being run over in the games, but rather gremlins. Not just to dissociate from the film, but to claim this game is more socially acceptable, as the issue only seems to arise when Death Race is seen as unjustified violence against humans. Let's unpack that other word a bit, unjustified, as there were plenty of other video games at the time which portrayed violence against humans. Other games, like Outlaw and Tank 8, that featured human-on-human violence, fit within broadly accepted cultural and historical narratives of violence. Military games in particular would not have disrupted the accepted governmental monopoly on violence. War is commonly justified, or even glorified, as a defensive practice at the very least, as well as a means of preserving certain ideals or even proving national vigor. The difference in the violence between games like Death Race, Manhunt, Grand Theft Auto, Mortal Kombat, versus games like Battlefield, Assassin's Creed, Metal Gear, Fire Emblem, and countless other examples in each camp, all of which feature human-on-human violence, is that one side exhibits socially acceptable justification, whereas the other does not. War is an excellent example of something commonly seen as socially acceptable violence. Media depicting soldiers waging war on the battlefield would not stir up anywhere near as much controversy as media featuring taking out pedestrians on the street. If you have your doubts about war being socially acceptable, look at the fact that it's been used as an element in the plots of both Pokemon and Mario games, some of the most family-friendly brands in the video game market. That sounds pretty socially acceptable to me. You see, the man turned the machine into the ultimate weapon and became a bringer of destruction that ended the war. That's not a problem, that's an interesting plot element. The man didn't turn the machine into a Toyota and start running over civilians on the street. Now that would make people wince and write many an angry article. To ensure I'm not misconstrued, I do need to emphasize, I'm not trying to make the argument that war is always a socially acceptable thing, but rather, that war is typically considered socially acceptable enough in the justification behind its violence to be considered fair game to cover in media and entertainment, though that can vary depending on how applicable it can be considered to be to real-world events, and what those real-world events are. In terms of mainstream media taking issue with violence in video games, this seems to arise when the type of violence is applicable to the real world, usually in the form of human-on-human violence, and the cause is seen as unjustified or non-socially acceptable. These are the key ingredients to create a video game with a good chance of being seen as problematic.
We have to look at the internet because a lot of bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed.
These types of problematically violent video games are often regarded as such due to a fear of mimicry, that players will adopt the behavior depicted in video games and become more aggressive in nature. There exist countless studies into this subject, with no clear correlation between the two. But that isn't to say that people don't pick up what media teaches, it just isn't in the way that news outlets often portray. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who'd play Death Race and decide they should mow down pedestrians, or play Mortal Kombat and decide they should try to rip out the spine of someone they get into a fight with. These drastic, over-the-top depictions in media aren't typically going to be reflected by humans because we recognize that these are drastic, over-the-top depictions, not meant to be indicative of acceptable real-life action. But what about depictions that are portrayed as the norm, making it seem like what's being depicted is normal, and therefore reinforcing the idea that it is? That's where we get into where I'd argue the true issue in video game and media in general, violence, lies. There's two key examples I'd like to illustrate here. The first is depictions of war, which, as we talked about, falls under generally socially acceptable violence. War is often glorified. The best of the soldiers are heroes, bravely facing their foes. Video games focusing on war are typically action-packed and intense. To draw a parallel to my essay on games as art, how these types of video games author artful play is through overcoming the challenge that is killing the opposing army while coming out alive yourself. Look at this shot from this Call of Duty trailer. Hella impractical and improbable, but one heck of an impressive play. These types of depictions of war are something in the best interest of promoting by those such as the US military. Not a video game, but take for example Independence Day Resurgence, where the clearly distinct from the US military has to bravely fend off the alien threat to what's presumably the whole world but appears to only really be the United States. The Pentagon did not provide production support to the movie Independence Day because it portrayed the military as ineffective against the alien threat. But in 2016, the United States Army developed a months-long, multi-platform promotional campaign for the movie's sequel. This film featured promotional material which would redirect to sites aimed at garnering viewer interest in military enlistment, and for the US military to get their personal information.
In order to compete to unlock those movie extras, fans are instructed to sign in with Facebook. But by doing so, it allows the US Army access to your Facebook page and your personal data along with it.
Take another example, Top Gun and its sequel. The US military allowed for the use of their aircraft and equipment. Under the condition, they had final creative say, ensuring they're represented how they want by the film, something not uncommon to the film industry. In a video game, you could make the argument that the key purpose of this design is to make the most engaging and fun video game you can make. This is something we've talked about more in depth in the History in Video Games essay. You can check out after this one if you'd like to explore this topic further. But for the short version, if you played a World War I game about living in the trenches for weeks or months, hoping you don't die of malnutrition, gas, or whatever else, that likely wouldn't be a very fun game. To create a video game people would actually want to play, some liberties may need to be taken, though in this case, those liberties do further reinforce the idea that war is a socially acceptable form of violence, even if it's not what the game intended. For my other key example, I want to draw on Persona 5. This is a game I only played for the first time semi-recently, and I have to say is one of my new favorite RPGs, largely because of some of the thought-provoking ideas it says about society, but there are some depictions I cannot help but find problematic. The first antagonist of the game is this male teacher at your school who's sexually abusing female students and physically assaulting male students, who nobody stands up to because of the influence of his position, in fear of what he can do, or in pursuit of the prestige he can grant them. This is something we see drastic consequences of in the game, the violent outcomes of his actions, making him a clear villain to be taken down. When a female teacher engages in a relationship with a minor and one of her students, however, oh, no, that's fine, there's nothing violent about that. Why? Because clearly the male here is the one in control of the situation. It only happens if it's his choice for it to happen. This is an idea we see perpetuated in many other forms of media, that men can't be the victims of sexual violence. It's their choice. As the male, they're the ones in control. Take some other depictions in the game. Sexually provocative jokes are often made towards the female characters of the cast, but despite insinuations of sexual violence, it's played off. Just boys being boys. He probably wouldn't actually do it, so it's fine to imply. The main character doing this is Ryuji, who later in the game has the tables turned on him when he's the victim of sexual insinuations before being dragged away against his will. And who are the ones doing these insinuations? Not women, but other men, in a scene ultimately played for laughs. Or one more example from the game. There exist 8 palaces in Persona 5 Royal, which are dungeons created by the cognitions of those with distorted desires, which usually means they desire something pretty evil. Out of these 8 palaces, 6 are men, 5 of which are pretty evil, and the royal exclusive one is morally ambiguous, and 2 are women, one of whom is a victim of her own negative emotions and needs you to save her, and the other of which is just salty at her workplace for feeling so luck-based and we don't even take her down. She's a good guy who works with the heroes. There are plenty of side quests to take down smaller foes of all sorts, but the main opposing forces in the plot are male. Across Persona 5's portrayals of those without good intentions, or implications of non-good intentions, let's say, it inadvertently argues that victims can be men and women, but the aggressors to the most serious of issues are only really men. And in many cases in media in general, if it's a man put into these kinds of situations, it's not to be taken seriously. If it's male on male, then it can be taken seriously if it's physically abusive. If there's intimate insinuations, then it's just played for laughs and isn't serious. If it's female on male, then it's what the man wants because he's the one in control between the two. Or in some situations, it can just be played for laughs as well, or to imply the male isn't manly enough or such. This more subliminal messaging by portraying certain depictions of the norm reinforces societal ideas of what we believe to be the norm in the real world, which can make it difficult for those with serious issues such as these to be taken as seriously as they should be. Though there are always exceptions to this that do attempt to illustrate the serious nature of these issues. Now, this is an argument I feel like I need to elaborate in on as well, to ensure I'm not misinterpreted as saying these types of games are maliciously pushing untrue societal norms or such. Are games like Persona 5 going out of their way to perpetuate ideas about society like this? That a male having a relationship with a minor is a problematic and awful thing that should be stopped, but there's no issue in a female having a relationship with a minor because it's the male's choice? Honestly, probably not. I would say most likely it's just somebody at Atlas living out some weird fantasy or fetish, or Atlas feeling like there's enough potential players interested in that it's worth including as an option. What about this overall depiction that the main driving forces are typically going to be men? Well, that's just become the norm with media. There's still this notion within the gaming sphere that video games are a male hobby, and if you take the time to look into the stats, you do find that video games are played by men as a majority, but barely. While true, it's kinda disingenuous to call it the majority that implies there's a significant difference. Despite this, it's become so much of a standard in not even just video games, where if men are in the key roles of power, then that's normal. But if it's a woman, then this piece of media is doing something different. This is a character. This is a female character. Why can't both just be called what they are? Characters. Feel free to disagree with me, but I personally feel like there's this idea where in media, if you go with what's the norm, then your content is less subject to criticism in its portrayals. These are just characters undertaking the plot. But if you differ from the norm, then you've now entered the circle of making arguments about whatever group you've decided to portray, and are essentially treading on thinner ice. Portray different groups in certain ways, and you enter a sphere of criticism from certain audiences about what you are and aren't allowed to do. Sticking with the entertainment norm remains the safest to follow what's established to work and incur as little risk as possible, especially in these massive multi-million-dollar projects within the entertainment sphere where you typically want to reduce risk as much as you can. If the story doesn't change with your character's gender, sexuality, race, or whatever else, then why not just go with the norm? The thing that's going to reflect the, barely, majority of your players and incur as little risk as possible in rousing controversy without changing the content. When I look at a game like Persona 5 focusing on putting the male characters into key positions of power, all I really see is a game following the established norm in the entertainment sphere. It's really not going out of its way to be using it to make arguments about society, and in and of itself as a completely isolated experience is not a problem. When I look at a game depicting war as this action-packed battle and socially acceptable form of violence, it's just following that established entertainment norm, and again, is not a problem as an isolated experience. Where the problem lies is where certain depictions of the norm are done by so many sources of media that it is reinforced as the social norm. And I'll admit, I'm not exempt from these kinds of arguments media reinforces. There are jokes I felt comfortable making about men that I'd never dare say about women, and that I'm not worried about causing any real backlash, because it's what media and society has taught me to be okay. You acquired the herb I requested. And I have this hunk of a man as well that I brought for you. You have 30 minutes. It begins now. Moments like that I can't help but think back on. Wonder why it is that this feels okay only when it's about one specific gender. And eventually end up making a video essay discussing it because that's what I do. And I'd be curious to hear what you think. In conclusion, whenever discourse on violence in video games is brought up, it's usually in regards to the question, do violent video games make people violent or increase aggression? It's a question I'm sure a lot of gamers are tired of hearing still being called into question, as video games that do not fit the mold of abstract enough from real life, or socially acceptable in the nature of its violence, continue to stir this discourse. While the most extreme of these acts depicted shouldn't be expected to be mimicked by players, those that aren't depicted as extreme, ones meant to be seen as the norm, may be slowly adopted into a worldview, especially if media reinforces it again and again and again. The more something is depicted as normal, the more normal it becomes. In 2006, Elder Scrolls Oblivion released a $2.50 golden horse armor cosmetic, and became the subject of scrutiny and the popular thing to point and laugh at for years. But then, almost every other major studio in the industry started further monetizing things, and nowadays if somebody complains about it, they'll often be met with responses from consumer swarms like, if you don't like it, don't buy it. As things are portrayed as the normal way for things to be more and more often, the more socially acceptable it becomes, as consumers begin to see it more and more as the norm. The true problem with violence in video games isn't players going out to mimic the violent acts they saw on the screen, but rather, the arguments that media makes through its portrayals as the normal expected outcomes, which situations involve violence to be taken seriously and seen as problematic, and which situations do not, because of their ability to reinforce certain perceived social norms. If you get any one takeaway from this essay, it's to not be afraid to question things that media portrays as either the norm or as socially acceptable violence. What's portrayed as problematically violent behavior, and what isn't considered violent or problematic. What's depicted as the norm, and what's the other. Don't be afraid to have your doubts. But with that in mind, don't stop enjoying whatever content it is you're passionate about. You don't need to agree with every single element of a piece to be able to have a meaningful experience with it. So get out there and enjoy the media you enjoy. And remember, each pedestrian is 10 points.
It's all harmless fun, says the Californian who devised Death Race. In Los Angeles, Paul Jacobs.
Death Race really is fantasy, and nothing more than that. And we don't try to depict anything that really happens in real life. Well, first of all, just a new twist into the game. We took the cabinet, painted it black, and tried to project skeletons or gremlins running across the graveyard.